Night of November 11th to 12th, 1940. Taranto on the heel of southern Italy. In the outer anchorage known as the Mar Grande, 6 battleships of the Italian Regia Marina lie at anchor behind torpedo nets, barrage balloons and gun batteries in water barely 40 feet deep, shallow enough that naval doctrine on both sides considered an aerial torpedo attack. They're close to physically impossible. Overhead, in the dark, 21 aircraft approach. Fairey Swordfish biplanes, open-cockpit, fabric-covered, first flown in 1934 and already regarded within the fleet air arm as obsolete. Within 2 hours, these 21 aircraft, for the loss of 2 of their own, will sink 1 Italian battleship at her moorings, cripple 2 more, and put half of Italy's battle fleet out of action in a single night, a result the entire pre-war strategy of both navies had assumed no aircraft could achieve. When Italy entered the war on June 10, 1940, the Regia Marina possessed, on paper, one of the most formidable battle fleets in Europe. By that autumn it counted 6 battleships in commission, including the newly completed Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, each displacing over 40,000 tons and armed with 15-inch guns. Britain's Mediterranean fleet, under Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, could muster only a handful of older First World War vintage battleships to match them. Malta lay within range of Italian bombers. Convoys to Egypt ran a gauntlet the length of the Mediterranean, and as long as the Italian battle fleet remained intact at its main base at Taranto, Cunningham was forced to treat it as a fleet in being, keeping his own capital ships concentrated rather than free to escort convoys, bombard the coast, or hunt Italian cruisers piecemeal. A single decisive blow against the fleet at anchor was the only way to change that calculation quickly, and no British surface ship could reach Taranto's harbour without running directly into the guns it was trying to neutralise. Only aircraft, launched from a carrier standing safely out to sea, could reach the anchorage at all. The plan, eventually codenamed Operation Judgement, met resistance from something more fundamental than institutional caution: the accepted physics of the weapon itself. Standard doctrine held that an airdropped torpedo needed roughly 75 feet of water to dive, level out, and begin running true. Taranto's anchorage averaged closer to 40 feet, a depth most officers regarded as flatly incompatible with any torpedo strike, disguise or not. The idea had first been worked up in 1938 by then Captain Lumley St. George Lyster, while he commanded the carrier HMS Glorious, who tested torpedo tactics against the shallow water problem in near total secrecy, deliberately keeping no written training records so the scheme would not leak. By September 1940, now a Rear-Admiral flying his flag in Illustrious, Lyster presented the refined plan to Cunningham in Alexandria, and it was scheduled for Trafalgar Day, October 21st, 1940, timed deliberately to echo Nelson, using 2 carriers, Illustrious and Eagle. Days before the strike, an accidental fire aboard Illustrious destroyed 2 of the Swordfish, earmarked for the raid, and on November 5th, inspectors found Eagle's aviation fuel lines cracked from the cumulative shock of near misses sustained over months of Mediterranean operations, so badly corroded that the risk of fire or explosion forced her withdrawal entirely. 5 of Eagle's aircraft and crews were hastily transferred to Illustrious, but the strike force that would actually fly was cut to 21 obsolete biplanes, launched from a single carrier against a harbour that most of the Fleet Air Arm's own peacetime doctrine said should have been unreachable by torpedo altogether. The problem was solved not by new aircraft, but by modifying the weapon. British engineers fitted the Mark 12 torpedo with an enlarged air tail, extra vertical fins added to the horizontal stabilizers to keep it stable during its drop and ensure it struck the water cleanly rather than tumbling. A fine wire spooled from a drum beneath the torpedo to the releasing aircraft and cut at a precisely calculated length hauled the weapon's nose up on entry so that it struck the water in a shallow belly flop rather than a steep dive, a modification that Lyster's testing had shown could make an air-dropped torpedo run true in water as shallow as 22 feet, a third of what the manuals demanded. At Taranto, the weapons were set to run at a depth of 33 feet, shallow enough to pass beneath the harbour's anti-torpedo nets, and they carried the duplex magnetic pistol, used for the first time in the Mediterranean theatre, capable of detonating either on direct contact with a hull or from magnetic influence as it passed beneath one. Around this re-engineered weapon, the Fleet Air Arm built a mixed strike package. Aircrew of 813, 815, 819 and 824 Naval Air Squadrons flew a first wave of 12 Swordfish, half carrying torpedoes and the rest bombs and parachute flares to illuminate the harbour and strike secondary targets, followed roughly 90 minutes later by a second wave of 9, built on the same template. It was a plan that asked ordinary carrier squadrons to do something no air force had attempted against a defended fleet at anchor, and it depended entirely on a torpedo re-engineered to defy what the manual said was possible. Illustrious, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, reached her launch position, designated Point X, roughly 170 nautical miles from Taranto, on the evening of November 11th. The first wave of 12 Swordfish left her deck between 2040 and 2057, led by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson of 815 Squadron, and flew close to 2.5 hours through patchy cumulus cloud under a 3/4 moon. Taranto's defences were formidable on paper: 21 batteries of 4-inch guns, 84 20mm Breda cannon, 109 machine guns, and 22 searchlights, though a storm days earlier had torn most of the harbour's 90 barrage balloons from their moorings, leaving only 27 still flying. Williamson's subflight put a torpedo into the battleship Conte di Cavour, tearing a hole roughly 39 by 26 feet in her hull below the waterline. His aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire moments later, and he and his observer, Lieutenant Norman Scarlett, were taken prisoner. The second wave, launched under Lieutenant Commander John Hale of 819 Squadron, scored 3 torpedo hits on the new battleship Littorio and 1 on Caio Duilio. Only one other Swordfish was lost. Its pilot, Lieutenant George Bailey, and observer, Lieutenant Henry Slaughter, both killed. By dawn, Conte de Cavour was resting on the harbour floor with 27 of her crew dead and over 100 wounded. Littorio, holed in 3 places, had taken on so much water that her forecastle nearly touched the surface. Caio Duilio had been deliberately beached to keep her from sinking outright. Vittorio Veneto and Andrea Doria, also present that night, were attacked but not hit. The strike did not happen in isolation. To draw Italian attention away from Taranto, a separate cruiser squadron, Force X under Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whippel, comprising the light cruisers Orion, Sydney and Ajax, with the destroyers Mohawk and Nubian, had turned north that same evening toward the Strait of Otranto, where Italian convoys ran troops and supplies across to Albania. Between 1:05 and 1:50 on the morning of November 12th, while the second Swordfish wave was still returning to Illustrious, Pridham Whipple's ships intercepted and sank 4 Italian merchantmen, Capovado, Catalani, Locatelli and Premuda, and damaged the torpedo boat Nicola Fabrizi, a coordinated action fought entirely separately from the airstrike, but timed to the same night to split Italian attention across 2 threats at once. If a raid built around re-engineered torpedo doctrine and a fabric-covered biplane sounds like exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, subscribing costs nothing and means you will not miss the next one. Italian losses across the fleet came to 59 dead and roughly 600 wounded against 2 British aircraft and 4 aircrew, 2 killed and 2 taken prisoner. Distinguished service orders went to Williamson and Hale, with further distinguished service orders, distinguished service crosses and mentions in dispatches distributed among the rest of the air crew who had flown the raid. Set against those decorations sat the raw arithmetic of the operation. A strike force of aircraft, weighing under 2 tons apiece, empty, built from wood, wire and fabric, capable of barely 138 miles an hour, had disabled 3 battleships whose individual displacements ran from roughly 26,000 to over 40,000 tons, protected by nets, balloons and more than 200 anti-aircraft guns. Littorio returned to service within about 4 months. Caio Duilio needed 7. Conte de Cavour never fought again. Salvaged at enormous effort over the following year, she was seized incomplete by German forces after Italy's 1943 armistice, damaged further in an Allied air raid in early 1945, and scrapped in 1946 without ever putting to sea as a warship again. The tactical effect was immediate. With half of Italy's battle line crippled overnight, Cunningham could divide his Mediterranean fleet rather than husband it against a numerically superior opponent, freeing ships to escort convoys and support operations he could not have risked days earlier. The Italian Navy withdrew its surviving battleships from Taranto to the more distant, better defended harbour at Naples, conceding the immediate operational initiative in the central Mediterranean. The raid's influence reached further still. In 1941, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito, Assistant Naval Attaché to the Imperial Japanese Navy in Berlin, travelled to Taranto specifically to study how the attack had been carried out, and later briefed Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the first wave against Pearl Harbor that December. The shallow water torpedo problem the Royal Navy had solved with a wire spool and a magnetic pistol became, within a year, a template studied by the Navy that would attack an anchorage on the other side of the world, this time using purpose-built torpedo bombers rather than obsolete biplanes, and with far larger battleships as the targets. None of it was decided by anything written on a specification sheet. The Swordfish that flew against Taranto was, by every published figure, an obsolete design, slower than most contemporary fighters, unarmoured, so lightly built and so slow that anti-aircraft fire directors calibrated for faster monoplanes routinely threw their shells out ahead of it, exploding harmlessly in empty air. The torpedo it carried had been engineered around a limitation the manuals said made the entire mission impossible. What actually sank Conte di Cavour and crippled Littorio and Caio Duilio was neither the aircraft's horsepower nor its armour, both of which were negligible, but a small number of air crew and engineers who treated "cannot be done in water this shallow" as a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be accepted. 13 months before Pearl Harbor gave the idea its infamous name, Taranto had already proven it. The paper specifications of a fleet at anchor meant nothing against an enemy willing to rewrite the specifications of the weapon aimed at it.